Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. We are on season 6, growth, marketing, and how to handle that growth. Sometimes so much growth can be an issue where you got people calling, you got stuff coming in, keeping up with the growth can be difficult. We've reached out to a unique company today, and we have with us Connor Ludlow, the COO of CallForce, with us today. Connor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Tell us how you got started with CallForce. It sounds like you've been there since the beginning.
Growing up, I would have never expected to be in the dental world.
In the dental, phone answering world.
I don't know if it was actually a bad experience, but something that as a kid kind of put a bad taste in my mouth for
Sure.
dentists. And so growing up, it kind of took me a while to get over that. It wasn't until one of my best friend's dads became my dentist that I kind of even warmed up to that whole side of things. And so if somebody had told me that I'd be here, you know, 10 years ago, I probably would have laughed.
When and how did CallForce get started?
Yeah, so CallForce started about 4 years ago. We started out actually just doing outbound phone calls for dentists. So we placed recall phone calls and purely just those recall phone calls. We didn't do much else. And
Mm.
after about a year of doing that, that's when we kind of branched into other areas, launched our answering service, started doing unscheduled treatment, just to kind of round out our suite of front desk services. So we've been around for about 4 years now. We're located in Lehi, Utah. So it's been a good ride.
That's awesome. Okay, so and it was funny because I think Tyler from your team had reached out originally, and a few months ago I was like, "Well, we're not doing sponsorships. We're not doing these other things." But this is where I get to be selfish with shared practices is occasionally I'll start running into problems in my office and I get to then use the podcast as a platform to shop around and see what's out there and how things work. So I didn't realize that you guys started on the outbound
Mhm.
end and now you've kind of rounded it out and you answer incoming calls as well for like new patients. Is that correct?
Yep, that's exactly it. Yeah, so our answering service was actually our second service, not our first one. So
Hmm. And tell me about your role. I specifically asked. I was like, I'm hoping to talk to someone who deals with like the actual call center and all the calls coming in and the problems that come up and the resolution of those, training employees. So tell us about what you do at CallForce.
yeah, so I manage our call center. I'm our COO, and so I deal with all of the training, kind of everything that comes up there. A little bit on the product side with what goes on during those phone calls, what are our methods going to be, and how to try and get better and better in those areas as time goes on.
Okay, cool. Um, so let's talk about this generally. Let's start with a little bit big picture here, which is you know, if you are investing in some sort of marketing, there comes a point with that marketing where you want them to take action. And one of the most common actions is that you want them to pick up the phone and call your practice. And I have noticed that since we have cranked up the marketing recently at our practice, um, sometimes it's hard to keep up, especially because right now I don't have a dedicated receptionist. I've got a bunch of cross-trained team members who go between the front and the back. I have an office manager who can fill in and answer calls and all of that. And we are actively hiring. We had 2 interviews that fell through yesterday, so trying to find good people right now is hard, and everyone knows that. Um, and so, I need somebody. I need someone there, and I've talked to some of my friends, and some of them use answering services specifically for their new patients, um, just to make sure that those marketing dollars that they're spending on Google Ads and Facebook ads and other things aren't going to waste. So, do you feel like this is a common problem for dental offices to be struggling to capture all of those inbound calls?
Oh, 100%. And here's the thing is I look at it and I don't blame, a lot of dentists for those type of problems because you guys have a lot on your plate and sometimes it's not like you're dropping the ball on anything, but if you're with a patient, kind of like your scenario that you just mentioned, like if you don't have a front desk, your startup practice, it's just kind of a part of, I guess, the hand of cards that sometimes you get dealt. And also too, sometimes patients will call after hours or when you're at lunch, and that's not necessarily your fault. So 100%, I totally agree that it's a thing, and I don't blame you guys one bit.
Do you have any data on how often calls are actually missed by a dental office?
Yeah. So what we found is that on average, your average dental practice will miss about 32% of their phone calls. So pretty high number if you think about it in that sense. That's almost a third. So pretty
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, that's a ton. And
Yeah.
and do you know, here's another random question. Do you know like the rough volume of inbound calls that are coming into a practice on a given day? Like I'm trying to think of like 30% of, 20 calls versus 60 calls versus 100 calls. I guess it would depend on the size of the practice.
Yeah. It's such a wide range that you can have offices that are a little bit smaller and, it could be a few calls a day. I think that our average client is somewhere around the 110 to 120 a month.
Okay.
So I think that comes out to about four a day. So nothing, super crazy, but we have had some offices get to the point where, we are receiving 40, 50, 60 calls a day from them. I think we even crossed the 100 mark before with offices. So again, it's just something that happens. I don't think anybody's necessarily dropping the ball, but it is hard to get to every single phone call that comes in.
Totally. Well, and I've also seen people split out their existing patient calls versus their new patient calls.
Mhm.
And even kind of have like a phone menu of like new patients press one, existing patients press two. The existing patients gets directed to the practice, and the new patients gets directed to someone like CallForce. Is that something similar that you guys have done with clients in the past? And how have you seen that work?
Yeah, we've had people forward over all types of phone calls. I mean, our goal is always going to be to help get people on the schedule and to make sure that, above all else, that patients feel taken care of. Because sometimes they're actually, and this is one of the more unique parts of our job, and one thing that I feel like I look at a lot is sometimes there are times with us being outside of the office that really just that patient experience is what matters most, in these extreme emergency situations, or when someone has, a question for the dentist. That's something that we have to look a lot at, is just making sure that patients feel taken care of. And so we try to schedule, but above all else, we try to make sure that patients feel like they have a voice and that they're able to get a hold of the office, and whether that's a phone call back, whether it's actually getting scheduled into the appointment, but we try to make sure that they feel taken care of.
Well, and it sounds like you guys have the capacity to do it either way. You can do just new patients, or you could almost take all incoming calls because you're used to doing outbound calls on behalf of the practice.
Yeah, and the majority of our clients do send all types of phone calls over to us, because again, you never know when that phone call is going to come in, and even if it's not a new patient, for an existing patient having an emergency, or somebody who just has something that's common around kind of the tax season that we just went through, is that people will call in saying like, "Hey, I need this and this and this for my tax return," and they're frustrated if they don't get it, and so even questions like that, well, it's not a scheduled appointment, hold a lot of value. Whether it's us or you answering it, patients feeling like they have a dentist that they can trust and somewhere that they can go to, that family type feeling is huge for patients, and that's something that we try to help out with as well, on top of scheduling appointments. So any phone call that comes in, we try to be as helpful as possible.
Huh. Um, and so and our audience needs to know, number one, we don't have any sort of sponsorship relationship. I'm not currently a client of you guys. I'm definitely thinking about all this kind of stuff. So I kind of want to play the skeptical dentist for a second here. And you're not on the sales team, which is even better,
Yep.
which I
Yep.
appreciate. Um, I think that some dentists would think like, oh man, how is someone going to answer the questions around my office on my office's behalf unless they are my office? Like, how can they, resolve patients' concerns and all of this stuff remotely, not being in my office? Um, how do you guys do that? It seems like a logistical, difficult thing to do to kind of speak on behalf of the practice.
Yeah, for sure. That's an awesome question. I'm super happy you asked it, because I think that the pretty answer would be, oh yeah, we can be perfect. And the real answer, again, I'm not on the sales team, so
Sure.
I don't
Yeah.
know if they'd love me
That's
saying
great.
this, but the real answer is that sometimes we are going to get questions that we don't know the answer to. Something like a prescription. for example. We aren't going to know exactly what happened and what was discussed in that previous appointment, and we're not going to be able to write that prescription for a patient. But what we can do, and this is what we do, is when an office comes on, we do learn their procedures, their details. We create what we call a doctor profile for them that has things like billing contacts, insurance contacts, the names of all the doctors. So we do become acquainted with a practice, and for the most part, we can answer those questions very, very similar to how a practice would answer them. And then in those circumstances where we get a question that maybe we don't have the answer to, or sometimes even that the dentist might not want us answering,
Right.
what we do is that, again, it goes back to that patient experience. We make sure that the patient feels heard. We make sure that we gather information that the office might need in order to take care of it. And then we actually have a little customer portal that we built that offices can log into at any time and get notifications of those type of situations. So we put it into that customer portal so that the dentist can go and see it. So we do customize it. Things like scheduling, we can customize pretty much exactly to how the office would like us to schedule. But every once in a while, we do get one of those tricky questions, and we just make sure that the patient feels heard. We gather the needed information and then kind of tee it up for the office, I guess you could say. And then when they log in, they kind of have their list of action items of people that they could call back and help out.
Okay. Okay, cool. So you guys have limits and you're like, yeah, at a
Yeah,
certain point, it's not appropriate for us to be answering this type of question with prescriptions or other things.
yeah.
But we're going to collect all that information, set it up for the team.
Yeah.
Um,
And really our goal, is just to provide value for the dentist. We want to make sure that if you're spending money on marketing, which you guys are probably spending a lot of money on marketing, and that's something that you're putting a ton of effort into, that when that phone call comes in, you're not always missing it because of something that you're trying to miss a phone call for. It could be just an accident that it doesn't get answered. So we want to make sure that we capture that value above all else for your practice.
I have to imagine that another concern that comes up for dentists thinking about this is that like they're gonna know that it's not my office answering phones.
Mhm.
That it's like some patients who are frequent flyers and are in for quite a bit of treatment or work, like they know who's at the office and who's normally answering their calls. So that very well may be that like they recognize that like, oh, where's Audrey or where's such and such team member. Um, and the other thing I think of is, like, accents. Like, if you've got an office from the South or, a real specific area of the country, um, how do you handle that? How do you kind of, how upfront are you with patients, and does that come up where someone's like, "Is this is this the office?" I don't know.
Yeah. No,
You know where
that's
I'm
an
coming from.
awesome question. Yeah, no, I really like the question. So our mission statement at CallForce is to strengthen the relationship between dentistry and its patients. And so when we answer the phone, we're going to answer the phone as, "Hey, this is Connor with Smith Family Dentistry. How can I help you out today?" And if we can go through that whole phone call and help the patient out, get them scheduled for an appointment without, necessarily having to bring up that we're out of the office, that's great. And that's what happens on the majority of phone calls, is that because we have those details about a practice, because we have a lot of that information, we can go through and help those patients out. And we put, training into our reps to make sure that that phone call goes smoothly. If that other does come up, because like you mentioned, there are times where it's really hard to get around that we're not in the practice, and it's almost worse for the patient experience to try and cover that up. So we actually will just very simply say, I help answer phone calls for the office. I work out of the office. And then we'll kind of go back to the question and try and help out as much as we can. So we actually try to avoid seeming shady or avoid hiding up any truths. And if people keep pushing on that, we'll tell them that we help out as kind of like a third party provider. But we try to keep it in a way to where that relationship is always maintained so that the patient never feels like a dentist was being weird or dishonest or
Sure.
shugging off responsibility.
Okay, cool. No, and I like that, how you just kinda keep it simple of like,
Yep.
I help answer calls,
Hmm.
I'm out of the office, and then just kinda redirect it back
Yep.
to patient's concerns.
Yep.
Um, okay, cool. So, uh, what and once again, I love that you're handling all my sales, objections, and you're not on the sales team. Um, what sort of hour coverage do you guys have? I know you guys
Mhm.
are located Mountain Standard Time. So you might have East Coast clients, you might have Pacific clients. How do
Mhm.
you handle that with your call setup?
So we have a pretty wide range of hours. We open at 5 a.m. Mountain Time, so 7 Eastern, and then we close at 9 p.m. Mountain Time. So we're open pretty much the whole day. And then we're also open on Saturday and Sunday from 7 to 5 Mountain Time. So those are our hours, and that helps out with, those times that offices are closed or out to lunch, where we try to be there and available in those circumstances.
Okay, cool. So
Yep.
it is one way to kind of really open up the coverage of the possible hours that a patient could call in.
Yep. Yep.
Um, okay. Um, Now I want to focus on the quality of calls and helping deal with kind of, I mean, you have to train the call center and you have to field the call center problems. So you're very familiar with getting people good at answering the phones for dental specific stuff. So where does this go wrong? Like what do offices do poorly in general? Because I've been asking a bunch of personal, like, I'm thinking about Call Force and I'm gonna pepper you with questions. Um, but let's take this back to like more general principles that a dentist could help their team listen to and work on. So where do people not do a great job answering the phones? And let's stick with new patients for now.
Yeah, for sure. And I love these type of questions. Again, I'm not on the sales side. So, and going back to what we were talking about before, like I never expected that I would be here, talking about dentistry, but things like that is actually part of the, spot that I really enjoy at my job is just those type of concerns. If you have a new patient coming in, how can we make this phone call really good? And that's all we do, right? So it's kind of that challenge of becoming the best at handling those concerns. And yeah, in a weird nerdy way, I guess I like talking about it. But no, I think that where a lot of, even some of maybe our new trainees or things that we might have done when we first started out as a company is when you get those phone calls coming in, especially from new patients, I've noticed that they come in and there's a lot of information right off the bat. They could, come in from more of the emergency angle of, hey, I just moved into town and this just happened and I'm in a ton of pain and I'm bleeding. And it's really easy to get caught up in all of that information that a patient is kind of telling to you and going through, all the different details, all the things that they're requesting, the questions that they're asking. And what we train our reps to do is to kind of just take a step back from that and think, okay, let's assess the situation. And we call it actually buckets. What bucket does this fall into? Is this an emergency? Is it just a new patient who's looking for a new dentist? And then once you know what bucket it's in, once you've kind of taken that step back, even if a patient has spent 2 or 3 minutes telling you about how their son got their tooth knocked out playing hockey, you know which bucket it's going to go into, and then you can kind of start directing that phone call yourself. And the nice thing about that is then, and this is what we do, is then once you can kind of take control of that phone call and go through the information that needs to be talked about or any of the procedures to get someone to schedule, we can train really heavily on those type of moments. And then when our reps get really good at putting it into those buckets, that's how we see success, because you're not trying to train on 1,000 super small individual situations, but what you're doing is you're getting very, very good at the main scenarios that come in, and kind of the core of what you want to accomplish with a new patient phone call, which is getting them on the schedule. So that's what we try to do, is to simplify things a little bit, take a step back, assess the situation, and then dive into scheduling the patient.
Okay, so now you've got me super curious about the buckets. What what
Yes.
are what are some buckets that calls
Oh,
fall
we've
into?
We've got lots of them. I think that in total, I want to say off the top of my head that it's 16 or 17 buckets. We have our
Okay.
action items. So, action items are things like scheduling an appointment, emergencies, rescheduling, canceling, all of those type of things that kind of involve getting in on the schedule. And then we also have buckets for kind of some of those things I mentioned before. Somebody needs a refund, somebody has a question about their bill, those type of aspects. So, really, what we do is we take those categories of phone calls, and then just create the little bucket around them. So,
Okay. Okay. So um let's go back to the new patient. So non-emergency, we're gonna choose our bucket. We're gonna go deep on the
I
bucket.
like it.
Non-emergency new patients. So just looking for a new dentist, generally. And but they're kind of, kicking tires and trying to figure out, like, is this the office for them? On the fence. Um, and they've got a lot of questions. I feel like a lot of times how patients ask questions on that call of like, do you guys take my insurance, or what's the cost of a crown? Or, there's a lot of really specific questions. And I feel like offices kind of lose people on those questions. So talk to us about some of the questions in that standard new patient bucket. What kind of incoming questions do you guys get, and how do you handle those?
Yeah, exactly. Um, so this actually brings up a very interesting concept that we've spent a decent amount of time on when it comes to those questions, especially with new patients. Um, when patients are asking questions and things like that, you made a very interesting comment of like, we're trying to prove to them that we are the right office, right? You say the patient wants to know whether this is the right office for them. And we try to come from that angle of that assumption. You want to make that, right? We want to be the right office for them. And I think that when you kind of come, going back to what I said about buckets, once you know that it's that bucket, you've kind of taken that step back. That's part of it, is saying, okay, this is a new patient. Our goal is to get them on the schedule. We want to be the right office for them. And very common with questions is that a patient will ask a question, and we'll see offices that dive very into the specifics, in the sense of, if somebody said, what times do you have available, we like to give yes and yes answers to questions. Or if we hit them back with a question, that it's kind of a yes and yes type scenario. So things like, do mornings or afternoons work best for you? Or having responses to some of those questions that kind of just show this is the right office for you. Like, we want you to come in. So somebody's asking about insurance, making sure that we kind of, even just right off the bat say like, yeah, for sure, let's definitely take a look into that, because we'd love to have you in. And kind of right up front, you're telling the patient, we want to be the right office for you. And then you kind of dive into the answers for those questions. And we always try and come from that angle, to keep the focus, again, just making sure that the patient feels heard, that the patient feels taken care of. And that's something that I think, I'm talking about CallForce, but anyone can do that. Anybody can come with that mentality of, we want to be the right practice for you. And we don't need to be bashful about that. Somebody says they've moved into the area, say, great, like, we'd love to have you in. We'd love to meet you. Just small little things like that subconsciously make a big difference.
Nice. Okay. So I like how you say yes and yes. So, like, do you take my insurance? And the answer wasn't, I don't know, what is your insurance? Let's find out. It was, yes, we would love to look into that for you
Yep.
and get you into the office.
Yep.
Something like that.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly.
What are some other common questions? I guess pricing. So if someone
Mhm.
says, "Hey, how much does a crown cost at your office?" How would you handle that question
Yeah.
on a new patient call?
Yes, and this is very, very common, as I'm sure that everybody knows. There's, and I'm the same way too sometimes. You don't want to go into something and get blindsided with a big bill, right? So the way that we handle those questions is, it's hard sometimes to give an exact price over the phone, and that's not even us trying to be sneaky. It's kind of how it is, especially with a lot of dental procedures. Something that's very common that we get is, somebody will call in and they'll say, hey, I need a root canal, or hey, I need to get my tooth pulled. And the feedback that we've gotten from dentists is that sometimes you can't take their word from it. Maybe
They
that.
think they need this, but
Yeah.
they might actually need something else.
Exactly. So the way that we handle it is actually pretty simple, because they're calling in. And the reason why they're asking that is because in their head they're worried about $1,000 bill, a $2,000 bill. And so the way that we try to overcome that is just by saying, well, we want to make sure that we give you the best quote possible. Again, like, they don't want to get told pretty answers. They don't want to hear that they're going to have some massive bill. And so we say that kind of right up front. We want to make sure that you get an accurate bill. We actually flip the script a little bit, and we will try and schedule them in for an exam with the doctor. Um, the nice thing about that is that once you get them into the office, then you can kind of walk through. And so if it does end up being, $1,000 bill or a $2,000 bill, it's not that price shock, because they've kind of been in there. You're talking through the X-rays with them while you're kind of telling them that news. And also sometimes, you get them in for that exam and it might not be as bad as it was. And so that's usually how we go about those pricing questions. Just say, we want to make sure that we give you the most accurate answers possible. So what we can do is we can get you in for an exam with the doctor, and then we have pricing on those exams so that they know that coming in for that isn't going to break the bank for them. And a lot of
Nice.
offices, will have free exams. And that's something that we think from our, obviously this is from our perspective, but something that helps out a lot. Because then that response, those are your high value appointments. When somebody calls in wanting some sort of treatment, the chance that it does end up turning into one of those multiple thousands of dollars appointments is a little bit more high. And so a lot of offices that we work with will have either some sort of special or some sort of consultation that's a very low cost or sometimes even free for a patient to get them in, just on the chance that they do come in and then it ends up becoming a valuable appointment. So it was worth it to kind of take that hit on the exam. So that's usually how we overcome those pricing concerns, is try and get them something that they feel comfortable with to get them in the chair, and then they can move forward from there.
Okay. Okay, cool. I love that, and I'm a big fan of, especially if someone's looking for something specific, doing consults. I don't mind. Other dentists say, you're trading your time for money, and it's every little piece matters. And I'm like, well, I don't know what they need, and they don't know what they need until I get them in there and I see, and I don't want there to be any barriers for them to come see and come figure that out. So I very much agree with that principle.
Yep.
Um, I will ask. This is back to more of like an earlier question, and then we're already on a bunch of tangents back and forth here. Um, who does this not work out for? I'm sure you've had offices that have signed up with you guys and have, thought it was going to be one way, and it just didn't work for whatever reason. Um, who is not well set up to handle this kind of relationship where you're kind of working together to manage these patient calls?
Yeah, I would say that for the most part, I feel like we do a good job of catering to, small practice, large practice, whatever the situation might be, multi-location, single location. Really, what I would say, what it comes down to, and this is what we talk a lot about in kind of our meetings at CallForce, is we try to cater to growth-minded dentists, and I feel like growth-minded dentists see a lot of success with us because we do have a good ROI. Our services average a 10 times return on investment, and so the reason why is because we're capturing a lot of those opportunities, right? We're getting appointments scheduled, which is a direct correlation with some of that income and profitability. Really, the only time that I feel like, maybe it might not be the right fit, or we kind of have to have that harder discussion with a practice during the sales phone call, is when they're almost looking at us as more of a, I guess, replacement, you could say. We try
Mhm.
really hard. We can be very, very helpful, and we do work with a lot of offices who maybe don't have a front desk member or are short a staff member, startup practices, a lot of those type of situations. But we still, at the end of the day, are not an employee in the office, and kind of that, I guess, the random tasks and things like that, we're not necessarily just an outsourced employee, you could say. So that's probably the only thing that I would say is, as long as an office kind of has that growth mindset, and our goal again is to strengthen that relationship between dentistry and patient and its patients. And for the most part, that is what happened. But every once in a while, we get somebody who, wants it to be just, I guess, a little bit too specific, or too into the details. And it honestly comes from a place of, we'd love to, and a lot of times, we can do small little things like that, but we also don't ever want to cause mistakes. And so anytime that we feel like something could be branching into that area where we could potentially be giving wrong answers or doing things that we probably don't have the most accurate information on, that's where we start to pump the brakes a little bit.
Okay, cool. Well, and it sounds like if someone is expecting, "Hey, I'm just gonna hire call force, and then I don't need someone at the front desk.
Yeah.
I could just worry about everything in the back." That's where it's probably they're leaning too much on what you guys can provide.
Yeah, exactly. One thing that we always tell offices is there are going to be times that you will have to call somebody back. There's going to be again, the prescription scenario, or something that, a patient wanted to finish a conversation that they were having with the dentist when they were in the day before. And that's a huge bummer for patients when they call in, and we handle that phone call well. We know the dentist name, so we can get the message over to the dentist. But then that patient doesn't get a call back, and then suddenly they're calling in upset, and they feel like the dentist just forgot about them or didn't call them back. So we always let offices know, there are going to be times where you do still have to call a patient back. So we want to make sure that it's a good teamwork type thing where we can capture that opportunity for you, take some of the work off the plate, by scheduling appointments, but also acknowledging that it's not like we're completely taking the work away.
No, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. And I think those expectations up front are probably a huge part of that. Um, how about on your outbound calls, how do you train for conversion and collections and handling objections of patients who either owe the practice money or need to come back for treatment that's been, treatment planned but not scheduled? How do you help patients come back into the office?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with our outbound services, we actually do a little bit of prep work before we call out. So recall, for example, we actually go in and pull that recall list beforehand, and we just filter through that. We have a little software that we built that will filter through on some of those criteria that you mentioned. So things like, you mentioned overdue balances. We actually can filter out patients that have large balances, whatever it may be there. And so we try to do a little bit of prep work. And then with us being the ones to actually call out, we also get kind of the liberty of being able to be the ones to ask some of those questions. And so that's where it comes back to those yes and yes questions. Again, just saying, hey, we'd love to have you back in the office. Do mornings or afternoons work better for you? And some of those yes and yes questions.
Okay, cool. Um, I'm trying to think what else am I like not asking about what you guys can do for patients or about how the dentist can improve like how training team members like if you a dentist were to record the calls that were happening in their office and to try and train on that. I think a lot of dentists might be able to identify when something isn't going well,
Mhm.
but they don't necessarily know how to fix it. Or do better on the phones. Are there any more specifics that you could pass along to dental offices on phone skills and improving? Because I feel like there's a cycle of like we have an expectation that all of our reception type team members are going to be really good at answering the phones,
Mhm.
and then we discover they're not. But it's not this instantaneous like, oh, get better at answering the phones. It's kind of this feedback growth cycle. Do you have any from your experience training people up on this? They come in brand new and you're working with them to get good at answering the phones. Do you have any advice on how to train team members to get really good at this?
Yeah, for sure. And we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier too, but there's a lot going on at the front desk of a dental practice, and there's a lot of different tasks, a lot of different duties. And I think that one of the biggest things that can be done to help out in a lot of these areas is recall is something that you can systematize, and answering phones again is something that you can give priority and kind of put into a little bit of that system. And so when recall, again, using that as an example, if it's something that gets touched on once a quarter or once every few months, odds are that it's probably, the first 10, 15, 20% of the list that's getting touched. And then again, it happens again in 10, in 3 months, it goes through that same 10 to 15%, maybe with a couple new patients in there. And so really what I think it comes down to is that it needs to be acknowledged as this is a big part of running a dental practice, right? Like, you hear all the time, as cheesy as it is, about how first impressions matter, and that's what phone calls are a lot of the time, is that first impression. And so when it comes to building a good system for handling that, that is really big. And I think that when it comes to training, that just involves getting down into the weeds and kind of treating it like, hey, this is the first impression of a dental practice. So some of the things that you mentioned, like listening to phone calls, is big. making sure that that is something that is consistently happening. So not just, okay, someone's been on the phone for a week, they're good to go. That's probably something that should be touched on once a month, maybe a couple times a month once somebody gets up and running, just to ensure that we're staying consistent and that we're always improving on that front, that we're not getting complacent with any phone calls or missing opportunities. So I think that a lot of training, there's a lot of different methodologies out there. I've talked a little bit about ours, and honestly, I've heard of a lot that I really like. And so I don't think that there's necessarily a silver bullet when it comes to methodologies for what's actually said on the phones. But when it comes to training, in my opinion, one of the biggest things is just recognizing that, hey, this is the front gate to our dental practice. A lot of patients, this is where that impression is going to be made, and this is where we could potentially get new patients or extra new patients. So we're going to make sure that that's something that we treat as such, and that we make sure that when we put somebody on the phones and when we're training a new rep, that we make sure that they have everything that they need to succeed and that we're supporting them. And that's something that I think that, again, it's not a call force thing. I think it's something that everybody can do, just to make sure that when a patient calls into the practice, that they're having a great experience, and that if it is their first time, that they're having a really good first impression of the practice. So that's what I would say about training, just making sure that it gets that attention it deserves.
Totally. And it's one of those things that I think answering the phones is just an assumed thing in general, and then training around answering the phones is another thing that probably just doesn't happen most of the time. Um, but even stuff like the attitude with which you answer the phones and how stressed you were the moment you were before you picked up that phone call comes across, and unfortunately that tone, um, even if people are saying the right things, but they're annoyed or they're stressed, or they're just not happy, that comes across really easily in a phone call. And even if someone scripted out the perfect, response to every call, you read those scripts and you're in a bad mood, it's not gonna come across well. So, um, that's something that, I don't know how to fix that too, because if you've got a really busy, stressful office and that's the person at the front desk, some people are better at just kind of flipping the switch of
Yeah,
like, "I'm gonna be happy and answer the phone now,"
yeah,
rather than, "What? What do you need?" That type of thing.
yeah.
So, a any advice on the tone with which the calls are answered?
Yeah, so actually that did bring one thing up to my mind. This is something we say, and we say it all the time, and it honestly sounds so cheesy and simple, but smiling when you're talking on the phone makes a massive difference. Even kind of like what you said, maybe you're having a stressful day, maybe you had to run to grab that phone, or you feel exhausted. But for some reason, just smiling when you're talking, I think that especially nowadays as technology becomes more and more of a thing, and phones are kind of through apps and through computers and things like that, it changes up that dynamic of a phone call a little bit, because you're not physically holding a phone all the time. But just having that smile when you talk to a patient, sitting up straight, smiling, even if you're having a bad day, the smile somehow translates through the phone call. And that's something simple that we tell our reps. It sounds cheesy, but it really does help. Just having a smile when you're talking completely changes the phone call.
No, and, I've heard someone say, like, "Hire happy," because you can
Mhm.
teach skills, you can teach all these other things, but you can't, like, teach someone to
Yeah,
be a happy person.
yeah, totally.
Um, so that's once again, it comes down to the challenge of hiring good people.
Oh yeah.
Um, well, cool. Well, if someone is interested in learning more and actually getting a hold of the sales team, what would be the right way for them to reach out to CallForce and find more about you guys?
Yeah, for sure. So our website is getcallforce.com. So callforce with the get in front of it, GET. Um, on our website, there's a form where you can contact a sales rep. You can kind of mark which service you're interested in, because we do have, those different services. And then one of our sales reps will reach out, schedule time, and we can kind of do a little demo of our services where we walk through whichever one you feel like would be the biggest help for your practice. So that would be the best way to reach out to us if you're interested.
Awesome. Well, Connor, thank you so much for coming on the show, answering all my questions. I'm going to be talking with you guys and talking with my office manager, and I appreciate you just kind of walking me through all the things that you do and the scenarios that come up. So thank you.
Hey, anytime. It was a pleasure to be here. I appreciate it.
We'll talk to you next time on the Shared Practices podcast.